There is a road in Paris that most travelers no longer notice. It runs quietly, behind the grandeur of what was once the Palais Royal, tucked between centuries of stone and shadow, where the clatter of modern life seems somehow thinner, as though the noise of today has not quite managed to fill the space left behind by something older and far more serious. Stand there long enough, in the early morning when the mist still clings to the cobblestones, and it is not difficult to imagine the sound of horses, the creak of leather, the soft, deliberate ring of a sword being drawn by a man who has drawn swords 1,000 times before and is entirely unafraid to draw it again. These were the king's musketeers. And before we say anything more, it is worth pausing on that phrase for just a moment, because the word musketeer has been borrowed so many times by novels, by theatre, by film, that its original weight has grown somewhat difficult to feel beneath all those layers of romance. We picture the wide-brimmed hats, the capes, the flashing steel and the breathless adventure. And those things are not entirely wrong. But they are only the surface of something far more interesting. The real musketeers of France were not simply soldiers. They were not mercenaries, nor decorative figures stationed at gilded doors for ceremony's sake. They were, in the fullest and most demanding sense of the word, an elite, chosen carefully from the lesser nobility and the most promising ranks of fighting men in France. They represented a standard of martial excellence that the French crown had spent generations attempting to define, and that these men, through years of grueling discipline, had actually achieved. To become a musketeer in 17th century France was to pass through a selection that modern soldiers would recognize more readily than most people expect. A candidate was evaluated not simply on his ability to ride or to fight, though those were non-negotiable foundations. He was assessed on his bearing, his nerve, his judgment under pressure, and, perhaps most critically, his loyalty. Not the performed loyalty of a man who wishes to appear faithful, the actual, tested, proven kind. The kind that holds when everything around it is falling apart. Training was continuous and layered. A musketeer was expected to be proficient with the flintlock musket that gave him his name, a weapon that in the 17th century demanded real technical knowledge, real patience, and real steadiness of hand to operate reliably under combat conditions. But the musket was only the beginning. He was equally trained in horsemanship, at a level that would be considered professional by any standard, capable of riding hard over difficult ground, managing a frightened animal under fire, and fighting effectively from horseback when the situation demanded it. And he was trained extensively in swordsmanship, not the polished, formalized fencing of the salon, but the actual applied sword work of a man who understood that a duel or a skirmish was not a performance. It was a problem to be solved, efficiently and finally. What made them reliable, to the king, to one another, to France, was not simply this technical competence. It was the culture they carried. The musketeers operated with a code of conduct so deeply internalized that it ceased to be a code at all and became simply the way things were done. A musketeer covered for his companions. He did not flinch from orders he found distasteful, but neither did he abandon his principles when those orders crossed a line. He was proud without being reckless, brave without performing it. The famous motto, Unus pro omnibus, omnes pro uno, one for all and all for one, was not invented by Alexandre Dumas. It was borrowed by him because he had found it already living inside the real institution, expressed not in words but in behavior, day after day, decade after decade. And what made them formidable, truly, genuinely formidable to anyone who stood against them, was the combination of all of these things operating at once, in men who had been selected for precisely this purpose, and who knew it. An enemy facing a company of the king's musketeers was not facing soldiers hoping to survive. He was facing men who had made a particular peace with the risks of their profession, who were technically prepared for almost any scenario, and who fought with the quiet, settled confidence that comes only from years of knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you are capable of. That is a rare thing in any era. And it is a story very much worth telling slowly. In the segments ahead, we will walk together through the full story. The origins of the Corps, the golden age of their power, the men who defined them, the battles that tested them, and the long, quiet twilight of their legacy. There is no need to rush. France has kept these secrets for 400 years. They will keep a little longer while we settle in. Segment 2. The Origins. How a king built his most trusted shield. Every institution that endures begins with a problem, not a grand vision necessarily, not a sweeping ambition written in careful ink by a philosopher or a statesman. More often than not, the things that last, the organizations, the traditions, the codes of practice that outlive the men who made them, begin with something far more immediate. A gap, a vulnerability, a moment in which someone powerful looks at the world around them and thinks, quietly and with great seriousness, this is not enough. For France, in the early years of the 17th century, that moment arrived with the reign of a king who had survived things that would have destroyed most men, and who understood, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how dangerous the world could be when you had no one absolutely certain standing beside you. His name was Louis XIII, and the institution he would shape, formally, deliberately, with full understanding of what he was building, would bear his mark for more than a century. But to understand why Louis built what he built, we must first understand the France he inherited, and that France was not the luminous, self-assured kingdom that would later dazzle Europe under his son. It was a country still breathing hard from decades of religious civil war. The wars of religion had torn through the French interior with a ferocity that left entire provinces hollowed out, and entire families unable to remember a time when neighbors had not been enemies. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was still a living memory to older men and women, not a historical event to be studied in books, but something that had happened to people they knew, on streets they still walked. France had been held together through the later 16th century, largely through the force of personality of Louis's father, Henry IV, a man of extraordinary political intelligence and genuine personal courage, who had navigated the impossible terrain of a country divided against itself with a skill that bordered on miraculous. And then, in 610, Henry IV had been assassinated, stabbed in his carriage on the Rue de la Ferronnière by a Catholic zealot named François Ravaillac, while the royal procession moved slowly through a narrow, crowded street. The king's guards had not been sufficient. The crowd had pressed too close. The moment had been ordinary enough that no one recognized it as the moment until it was already over. Henry IV was dead, and France was left with a 9-year-old boy on the throne, a regent who struggled to hold the court together, and a nobility that had never fully reconciled itself to royal authority. Louis XIII grew up understanding all of this in his bones. He was not, by temperament, a flamboyant man. He was reserved, watchful, and privately melancholic, qualities that are sometimes mistaken for weakness, but which, in a king surrounded by scheming courtiers and restless grandees, were more accurately understood as a form of long, patient attention. He watched people, he remembered what he saw, and he learned, from the example of his father's death, as much as from anything else, that proximity matters, that the body of a king is a political fact, that the men standing closest to that body determine, in ways both symbolic and entirely practical, whether a dynasty survives or collapses between one heartbeat and the next. The corps that would become the Musketeers did not appear fully formed from one single royal decree. It evolved, as most real institutions do, through a series of decisions that built upon one another over time. The earliest roots reach back to 1600, when Henry IV established a company of light cavalry called the Carabines. armed with a new and still somewhat experimental weapon called the carbine, a shorter-barreled firearm that could be managed on horseback. This was already a statement of intent. Henry understood that firearms were changing war, changing the shape of power on a battlefield, and that an elite unit capable of combining cavalry mobility with firearm capability would be something genuinely new and genuinely formidable. When Louis XIII came into his own authority and began reshaping the royal household according to his own convictions, he returned to this foundation and rebuilt upon it more deliberately. In 1622, he rearmed the existing company with a longer, more powerful flintlock musket. And with that rearming came a new identity. The Musketeers du Roi, the King's Musketeers, a name that was both a description and a declaration. The choice of the musket was not merely practical. It was, in the political language of the era, a message. The musket was a weapon that required training, patience, and technical knowledge to use well. It was not a weapon for an undisciplined rabble. It was a weapon for men who had been taught to stand steady under pressure, to manage a complex mechanical process in the middle of chaos, and to deliver accurate, coordinated fire when accuracy and coordination were the difference between a successful engagement and a catastrophe. To carry a musket as a member of the Royal Guard was to announce to anyone paying attention that you were not merely armed, you were prepared. The first captain-lieutenant of the Musketeers, the officer who would set the tone for everything that followed, was a Gascon nobleman named Jean de Pers, Comte de Troisville. History would remember him primarily through Dumas's fictional rendering as Monsieur de Treville, and that rendering, while embellished, was not entirely unfaithful to the spirit of the man. Troisville's was a leader of exceptional personal authority. He was demanding, unsentimental, and entirely clear-eyed about what his king required of him, and what he in turn required of the men beneath his command. He recruited with discrimination, he trained with consistency, and he enforced standards in a court environment where standards were frequently the first casualty of politics, favoritism, and noble pride. Under Troisville's, the culture of the Musketeers began to acquire its particular texture. It was a culture built around a very specific kind of pride, not the decorative pride of men who wished to appear impressive, but the functional pride of men who held themselves to a standard, because the standard was real and the consequences of failing it were real. A musketeer who performed poorly in training was not simply embarrassed. He was a liability to his companions, to his captain, and to the king himself. That understanding ran through everything. It shaped how men practiced, how they competed with one another, how they behaved in the streets of Paris, where the musketeers were visible and public and constantly observed. And Paris, it must be said, was watching very closely. The capital of 17th century France was a city of approximately 400,000 people, enormous by the standards of the time, dense and complicated and politically alive in ways that the court sometimes underestimated. The Parisians knew their musketeers by sight. They knew the dark blue cloaks, the silver cross emblazoned on the front, the particular way these men moved through a crowd, not aggressively, but with the unhurried confidence of people who have never seriously had to wonder whether they could handle whatever came next. They were admired. They were gossiped about. They were, in the fullest sense, public figures, and their public conduct was a form of royal communication. A company of musketeers riding through the streets of Paris was the king telling the city, "Look at what I have. Look at what stands beside me." This public dimension of the court was not incidental. Louis XIII and his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, were engaged throughout this period in the long, difficult project of consolidating royal authority against the persistent centrifugal forces of French noble independence, regional autonomy, and religious division. The musketeers were part of that project, not only as a military capability, but as a symbol. They represented the idea that the king's power was not abstract. It was embodied. It had faces and names and was capable of appearing, at need, anywhere in France. Richelieu, for his part, understood this clearly enough that he created his own parallel company, the Cardinal's Guard, in a gesture that was simultaneously flattering imitation and competitive provocation. The rivalry between the Musketeers and the Cardinal's Guard became one of the defining tensions of court life in this period, and it was a rivalry that Dumas would later draw upon with great pleasure. But beneath the drama of that rivalry lay something serious. Two of the most powerful men in France were each investing in elite, personally loyal military companies because both of them understood that loyalty, at the highest levels of power, was not a sentiment. It was a strategic resource, and it needed to be cultivated, organized, and maintained with the same care one might give to any other instrument of state. What the Musketeers offered that no other institution quite could was the particular combination of personal loyalty to the king's person and professional military excellence. The noble cavalry of France were brave enough in the main, but their loyalty was complicated by family interest, regional allegiance, and the ancient traditions of feudal independence that made French nobles perpetually unreliable instruments of central power. The Musketeers, by contrast, were men whose identity was entirely bound up in their relationship to the crown. They were the king's Musketeers, not the Musketeers of Gascony, or of Burgundy, or of some great ducal house. That possessive was the whole point. It meant that when Louis XIII needed men around him whom he did not need to calculate, whose motivations he did not need to pass, whose reliability he did not need to test on each new occasion, he had them. They were already there, already prepared, already the thing he needed them to be. That is not a small thing for a king to possess. Henry IV had died in a carriage on a narrow street because, for one terrible moment, the right men had not been close enough. Louis XIII spent his reign ensuring that the right men were always close enough, and that when he sent them somewhere to do something that mattered, they were capable of doing it with a completeness that required no follow-up. He spent his reign, in other words, building something that would outlast him. As it happened, it would outlast him by a very long time. The corps Louis established would reach its greatest glory, not under his own reign, but under that of his son. The Sun King, Louis XIV, who would take everything his father had built and place it at the center of the most dazzling, and in some ways most dangerous, court in European history. But that is a story for later. For now, it is enough to sit with the image of the beginning. A watchful king, shaped by loss and suspicion and a particular kind of patient intelligence. A Gascon captain who believed that standards were not of formality, but of foundation, and a company of men in blue cloaks, forming themselves slowly into something that France had never quite seen before and would never entirely forget. The Musketeers were not born in a single moment. They grew into themselves, the way all serious things do, slowly, under pressure, in the quiet space between what was required and what was possible. Segment 3, the Golden Age. When Louis XIV gave the Musketeers the world, there are periods in the life of any institution when everything aligns, when the leadership is right and the moment is right, and the resources available are equal to the ambitions being placed upon them, when the men inside the organization understand, without needing to be told, that they are living through something that will be spoken of afterward. These periods are rare. They cannot be manufactured by policy or purchased by wealth alone. They require a particular convergence of personality, of circumstance, of historical pressure applied in exactly the right direction at exactly the right time. For the Musketeers of France, that convergence arrived with the reign of Louis XIV. And it arrived, as most truly significant things do, not with a fanfare, but with a problem. Louis XIV was 4 years old when his father died in 1643. France was once again, as it had been when Louis XIII was a child, a kingdom governed by a regent and watched hungrily by a nobility that had never fully surrendered its appetite for independence. The regent in this case was Anne of Austria, the young king's mother, a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable courage, who leaned heavily in the difficult early years on the counsel and authority of Cardinal Jules Mazarin, Richelieu's chosen successor, and, in many respects, his political heir. The years of the Regency were not quiet years. The Fronde, that extraordinary, sprawling, half-organized uprising of nobles and parlements and discontented Parisians that broke out in 1648, and simmered and flared in various forms for the next 5 years, was the last great spasm of French noble resistance to royal centralization. It was, depending on one's perspective, a civil war, a constitutional crisis, a noble temper tantrum of epic proportions, or some unstable combination of all three. What it was, without question, was dangerous. The young king was forced to flee Paris more than once. Mazarin was driven into exile. The court was humiliated, threatened, and at certain moments genuinely uncertain of its survival. Louis XIV remembered all of it. He was not Louis XIII, watchful and melancholic and content to exercise power through carefully chosen intermediaries. Louis XIV was a man of appetite and certainty, possessed of a personal magnetism so powerful that it functioned almost as a political force in itself. He was tall, physically imposing, and from his earliest years as a fully adult king radiated the unshakable conviction that he was not merely a king, but the embodiment of France, that the interests of the state and the interests of Louis were, at the deepest level, the same interest, and that anyone who failed to understand this had simply not thought carefully enough about the matter. When Louis XIV took personal control of the government in 1661, following the death of Mazarin, one of his first sustained projects was the expansion and elevation of the Musketeers. He understood what his father had understood, but he took it considerably further. Louis XIII had built the Musketeers as a personal guard, loyal, capable, proximate. Louis XIV rebuilt them as something more like a statement of civilization. Under the Sun King, the Musketeers became 2 companies. The first company, the elder and senior corps that Louis XIII had established, and a new second company, created to double the corps' capacity and to provide the king with a deeper reserve of proven, elite men available for whatever the crown required. This expansion was not merely numerical, it was qualitative in its ambitions. Louis XIV wanted his musketeers to represent France at its most capable, to be, in the presence of foreign ambassadors and rival courts, living evidence that French military culture was operating at a level that no other nation in Europe could quite match. The musketeers were drilled more intensively, equipped more lavishly, and deployed more strategically than they had ever been under the previous reign. Their famous blue cloaks, the cassack embroidered with gold and silver thread, bearing the distinctive silver cross on the front and the fleur-de-lis at its center, became one of the most recognizable military uniforms in Europe. And Louis XIV knew perfectly well what recognition was worth. But pageantry, however magnificent, was never the point. The point was capability. And under Louis XIV, the musketeers were tested in ways that made their capability undeniable. France under the Sun King was not a country at peace. The second half of the 17th century saw France engaged in a nearly continuous series of wars. The War of Devolution, the Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and eventually the War of the Spanish Succession. That placed the French military under sustained, serious pressure across multiple decades and multiple theaters. The musketeers were not sitting in comfortable barracks at Versailles while all of this happened. They were fighting in the siege trenches of Flanders, on the contested plains of the Rhineland, across the difficult terrain of the Spanish Netherlands. These men served as an offensive military force of genuine consequence, not merely as a ceremonial guard. This is perhaps the detail that most surprises people when they first encounter the full history of the Corps. The popular imagination places the Musketeers firmly in the corridors and antechambers of the palace. Magnificent, perfumed, engaged in duels over matters of court honor and guarding royal doorways with decorative solemnity. The reality was considerably more physical. A musketeer under Louis XIV was expected to serve in actual military campaigns, to endure the hardships of campaign life that bore no resemblance whatsoever to life at Versailles, and to fight in the grinding, dangerous work of 17th century siege warfare. A form of combat that was slow, technical, exhausting, and intermittently very lethal. The great engineer. Vauban. Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban. Perhaps the finest military architect of the age, the man who redesigned the defensive and offensive principles of European fortification, was himself deeply familiar with the Musketeers as a fighting force, having observed and worked alongside them across multiple campaigns. Vauban's method of siege warfare was methodical and systematic. Parallel trenches dug in careful approach toward a fortification, each stage of the advance covering the next. The whole operation designed to minimize losses while maximizing pressure. It was slow work. It required men who could maintain discipline and courage over weeks and months of discomfort, occasional terror, and the particular psychological strain of an enemy that you can hear but rarely see clearly, firing at you from behind thick stone walls. The Musketeers excelled at it, which tells us something important about the nature of their training and their character that the more glamorous stories sometimes obscure. It is relatively easy to be brave for a few dramatic minutes. It is considerably harder to be reliable across a 6-week siege in bad weather, with inadequate food, under intermittent fire, with the outcome still uncertain. The Musketeers were the latter kind of reliable, the kind that holds not in the moment of high drama, but in the long, grinding stretch of work that precedes and follows the moments anyone will later bother to write down. One man, above all others, came to personify the Musketeers during this golden age, in a way that has echoed down through 4 centuries to the present day. His name was Charles de Batz de Castelmore, known to history and to literature as D'Artagnan. The real D'Artagnan was a Gascon, as Dumas' fictional version would be. He was born sometime around 1611 in the Gascony region of southwestern France, the son of a minor noble family with more pride than property, a circumstance shared by a remarkable number of the Musketeers, for whom the Corps represented not merely a military career but an elevation, a pathway into the immediate orbit of royal power that their birth alone could never have provided. He arrived in Paris as a young man in the 1630s, joined the Musketeers, and spent the next 4 decades demonstrating, with a consistency that is almost startling in retrospect, exactly what the ideal musketeer was supposed to look like. D'Artagnan was brave in the way that serious soldiers are brave, not recklessly, not performatively, but with the settled practicality of a man who has assessed the situation and determined that the thing needs to be done, and that he is the person to do it. He was also, and this is perhaps equally important, politically intelligent. In the complex, faction-ridden environment of Louis XIV's court, where a man could be elevated by royal favor and destroyed by royal indifference with equal speed, D'Artagnan navigated with a sure-footedness that speaks to genuine social intelligence alongside his military gifts. He rose steadily through the hierarchy of the corps, from cadet to officer to, eventually, the position of captain-lieutenant, the effective commander of the first company of musketeers, the highest position available to a man of his background within the institution. Louis XIV, who was not generous with his trust in the way that men of lesser intelligence sometimes are, trusted D'Artagnan, used him for sensitive missions that required not merely physical courage but discretion, judgment, and the ability to handle complicated situations without creating new ones. When the disgraced finance minister Nicolas Fouquet was arrested in 1661, taken down by the king in one of the most coldly calculated acts of royal displeasure in French history, it was D'Artagnan who was charged with the arrest and with Fouquet's subsequent custody. The assignment was enormously delicate. Fouquet was immensely popular, had powerful friends, and was the kind of prisoner whose treatment would be watched and judged by the entire court. D'Artagnan managed it with a precision that satisfied the king, protected the prisoner from any worse fate, and reflected well on the corps. It was the kind of assignment that only goes to a man who has spent years proving, in smaller ways, that he can be trusted with the large ones. D'Artagnan died in 1673 at the siege of Maastricht, leading a charge with the Musketeers during one of the most intense engagements of the Franco-Dutch War. He was struck by a musket ball at close range and died, according to the accounts that survive, almost immediately. Before the city had fallen, before the campaign's final chapter had been written, Louis XIV, by multiple accounts, received the news of his death with visible and genuine grief. For a king who had spent his reign cultivating an image of serene solar impassivity, that visible grief was itself a statement. D'Artagnan had been, in some sense, the living definition of what the Musketeers were supposed to be. His death at the head of his men, in service of the king's campaign, was entirely in character. It was also, for the institution, an irreplaceable loss. But the institution itself continued. It had been built to outlast any individual man, and it did. The golden age of the Musketeers under Louis XIV was not simply a period of military achievement, though it was certainly that. It was the period in which the identity of the corps became fully formed and fully fixed, when the culture, the standards, the particular combination of martial excellence and personal loyalty and public visibility that made the Musketeers what they were crystallized into something stable enough to be transmitted from one generation to the next. Versailles itself played a role in this that is easy to underestimate. The Palace of Versailles, which Louis XIV transformed from his father's hunting lodge into the most elaborate court complex in the world, was not merely a residence or even a seat of government. It was a machine for producing a certain kind of social reality, a place in which every detail of daily life, from the precise timing of the king's morning rising to the exact precedence of noblemen at table, was organized to communicate a single overarching message about where power resided and what it looked like. The Musketeers, moving through that environment in their blue cloaks and their quiet competence, were part of that message. They were the visible, embodied answer to the question that every foreign diplomat and every restless French noble was perpetually asking: what, exactly, is it that holds all of this together? The answer moved through the halls of Versailles with a sword at its hip and its eyes quietly open. It had done so since Louis XIII first gave it a name and a purpose. Under Louis XIV, it had simply grown into the full measure of what it had always been meant to become. And the world, watching France in those decades, watching the campaigns, the diplomacy, the extraordinary cultural flowering that accompanied all of it, the world took note. The Musketeers were known across Europe, not as a myth, not yet, as a fact, as the specific, precise, and slightly unsettling fact of what a king could accomplish when the men around him were exactly what he needed them to be. That fact would not last forever. Nothing does, but for now. For the long, golden, complicated middle decades of Louis XIV's reign, when France bestrode the continent with an authority it had never quite possessed before and would never quite recover after, the Musketeers were at the absolute height of what they could be. And it was, by any measure, a remarkable height to stand at. Segment 4. The Code. Honor, brotherhood, and the unwritten laws that governed everything. Every institution that endures beyond its founders develops, Over time, a culture that is larger than any single rule written into any single document. You can read the formal ordinances of the Musketeers, the regulations governing pay, rank, equipment, the precise duties of officers, and the protocols for guard rotation, and come away with a reasonably accurate picture of the institution's structure. But you would be missing the most important thing, the thing that is hardest to legislate, impossible to enforce from the outside, and yet somehow more binding than any written law: the shared understanding of who these men were, what they owed each other, and what they could not do without ceasing to be themselves. Every serious institution has this. The military units that endure across generations, that produce not merely competent soldiers but men shaped by a distinctive culture, all have it. It lives in the stories told by senior members to junior ones, in the way a veteran handles a situation that no regulation quite covers, and a younger man watches and learns not what the rule says but what the right thing actually is. In the quiet, collective pressure of a group of people who have decided, together, that certain standards are not negotiable, and who enforce those standards, not through punishment, but through something considerably more powerful than punishment, the withdrawal of respect. The Musketeers had this culture in an unusually developed form, and understanding it requires us to understand something about the world that produced it. The world of 17th century French noble society, in which honor was not a sentiment or a metaphor, but a functioning social currency, as real and as consequential as money, and in many ways more important. Honor, in this world, was the thing that determined how you were treated by every other person in your social sphere. It was not simply reputation, though it was partly that. It was a kind of standing, a recognition by your peers that you were the kind of man whose word could be relied upon, whose conduct was predictable in the right ways, and whose sense of self-respect was sufficiently intact that he could be trusted to behave consistently when the pressure was on. To lose honor was not merely embarrassing, it was, in the fullest practical sense, ruinous. A man without honor in 17th century France could not form alliances, could not make advantageous marriages for his children, could not expect his word to be taken in a dispute, and could not, critically, serve in the kind of positions that gave life meaning and material security for a man of the noble class. Honor was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Lose it, and the structure above it came down. The Musketeers existed at the intersection of this broader cultural understanding of honor and the specific, additional demands of an elite military institution. What emerged from that intersection was a code that was stricter, in certain respects, than what the surrounding society required, and more nuanced, in other respects, than any written regulation could capture. The first and most fundamental principle of that code was reliability. A musketeer was expected to be the same man in all circumstances, in the presence of the king, in the middle of a campaign, in a tavern at midnight with his companions, in the street where no one of consequence was watching. This consistency was not merely a personal virtue, it was a professional requirement, because the entire value of the corps to the crown depended upon the certainty that its members would perform as expected, regardless of conditions. A guard who was impeccable when inspected and unreliable when not was no guard at all. The musketeers understood this, and they enforced it among themselves with a thoroughness that formal supervision could never have achieved. The second principle was discretion. The musketeers operated, by the nature of their role, in the immediate vicinity of power. They heard things, they saw things. They were present at moments that the crown had reason to keep private: political negotiations, personal disputes, the various delicate transactions of palace life that could not withstand public exposure. A musketeer who talked, who carried information from the inner circle of royal life out into the wider world of court gossip and Parisian rumor, was not merely indiscreet. He was dangerous. He compromised the security of the king, the privacy of the court, and the integrity of the entire institution. The cultural enforcement of discretion within the corps was, by all accounts, absolute. Men who could not keep counsel did not last long among the Musketeers, not because they were formally expelled, though that was possible, but because the community around them contracted. They were no longer included, no longer trusted with assignments that required sensitivity, no longer part of the inner conversations that gave membership in the corps its deepest meaning. In a world built on belonging and solidarity, exclusion from the center of that solidarity was a punishment more effective than most formal sanctions could hope to be. The third principle, and in some ways the most philosophically interesting, was the nature of brotherhood within the corps. The word brotherhood is used so frequently and so loosely that it has lost much of its original force. We apply it to sports teams, to fraternities, to professional associations that share a name and little else. In the context of the Musketeers, it meant something considerably more specific and considerably more demanding. Brotherhood among the Musketeers meant, at its core, that your companion's problem was your problem, not symbolically, practically and immediately. If a fellow musketeer was in danger, you moved toward that danger, not because you were ordered to, not because you had calculated the odds and found them acceptable, but because the social and moral logic of the institution made any other response unthinkable. If a companion had made an enemy, through a quarrel, through a matter of honor, through the ordinary frictions of life in a court full of ambitious and sometimes reckless men, that enemy was, to some degree, the enemy of the company. The famous scenes in Dumas's novel in which D'Artagnan's three companions insert themselves into his quarrels and fight beside him without knowing or asking much about the cause are, in this sense, more historically accurate than they might initially appear, not because the specific incidents occurred, but because the underlying logic of the behavior was real. A musketeer standing alone was unusual. A musketeer abandoned by his companions was essentially unthinkable. This collective solidarity had practical military roots, of course. A unit whose members could trust one another absolutely functioned more effectively in combat than one in which each man was calculating his own survival independently. The willingness to cover a companion, to hold a position when holding it was costly, to do the thing that needed doing rather than the thing that was safest. All of this was built on the same foundation of mutual obligation that expressed itself in the apparently more personal forms of brotherhood at court. The military function and the social culture were not two separate things. They were the same thing, expressed in different registers. The duel occupies a complicated and important place in any discussion of musketeer culture. Dueling in 17th century France was officially illegal. Cardinal Richelieu had moved aggressively against it, understanding that the practice was draining the country of talented young noblemen at an unsustainable rate and providing a mechanism by which personal grievances could escalate into serious social disorder. The edicts against dueling were real, and the penalties were severe. And the musketeers dueled anyway, with a frequency and enthusiasm that suggests the edicts, however sincerely intended, were operating against a cultural current, too powerful to redirect by decree. This created a permanent, productive tension in the lives of musketeers that is worth sitting with for a moment. These men were bound on one side by their duty to the king, their absolute defining obligation to serve, obey, and protect the crown and its interests. And they were bound on the other side by a code of personal honor that sometimes required them to respond to insult or injury in ways that the king's law explicitly forbade. Navigating between these two obligations required a kind of ongoing moral agility that was, in its own way, as demanding as any physical skill the corps required. The resolution, informal, never quite articulated as policy, but real and functional in practice, was that a musketeer was expected to manage his personal honor with discretion, not to avoid duels entirely, which would have been understood as a failure of courage and thus a failure of honor, but to arrange them quietly, to keep them away from official attention when possible, and to ensure that his conduct on those occasions was such that, if it did come to official attention, it could be understood as the behavior of a man of genuine principle rather than a brawler or a hothead. The distinction mattered enormously. A man who dueled because his honor, or the honor of a companion, genuinely required. It was in a different moral category, in the understanding of the time, from a man who dueled because he was violent or reckless or could not manage his temper. The Musketeers were expected to be the former kind always. What is perhaps most striking about the code, considered as a whole, is how thoroughly it was internalized rather than imposed. The regulations of the Corps could govern equipment and duty schedules and matters of pay and precedence. They could not govern the texture of a man's daily decisions, the small, constant choices about how to speak, how to respond, how to conduct oneself in the 1,000 unscripted moments that make up a life. Those choices were governed by something that had been absorbed during the years of formation within the Corps, transmitted from senior to junior members through example and expectation, and reinforced continuously by the community's collective judgment of whether a man was living up to what was expected. A young man who joined the Musketeers as a cadet did not arrive already possessing this culture. He arrived possessing the raw material, the noble birth or demonstrated fighting ability, the physical capacity, the baseline courage and competence that had earned him his place. The culture was what the institution gave him in return. It was, in a very real sense, an education, not in the formal academic meaning, but in the older, deeper meaning of the word. A drawing out and a shaping of what was already there into something more disciplined, more reliable, more fully realized than it would have been without the sustained pressure of this particular environment. The men who came out the other side of that education were different from the men who had entered it, not in their essential character, but in the degree to which their character had been organized around a set of values clear enough and strong enough to hold under pressure. That organization was the code. It had no single author, no founding document, no formal ceremony in which it was transmitted. It lived as all real cultures live, in the accumulated behavior of the people who carried it, in the stories they told, the expectations they enforced, the quiet, consistent pressure of men who knew what they were and held themselves and each other to that knowledge. 400 years later, we still recognize it when we encounter it, not because Dumas described it so memorably, though he did, but because the thing itself, the idea that the people beside you are your responsibility, that your word is your bond, that there are things you simply do not do because of who you are, is not a historical artifact. It is a human constant. And the Musketeers, at their best, lived it with an exactness that makes it recognizable across any distance of time. One for all, not as a motto, as a practice, daily, quietly, without ceremony or audience. That is the code. And that, perhaps, more than the swords or the blue cloaks or the royal warrant, is what made them what they were. Segment 5. The battles, where the legend was earned in blood and fire. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a battlefield before the fighting begins. Anyone who has studied military history closely enough, who has read the first-hand accounts, the letters home, the diaries kept in cramped handwriting by men who were not sure they would survive to finish them, knows this silence. It is not the absence of sound exactly. There are always sounds, the shifting of horses, the low murmur of men speaking quietly to the person next to them about nothing in particular, the distant and somehow unbearable sound of drums from the other side of the field. It is more that the ordinary texture of the world seems to thin out. Everything becomes very specific and very immediate. The quality of the light, the weight of equipment, smell of damp earth and gunpowder and horses, and the 1,000 other components of an army assembled in one place and pointed in one direction. The Musketeers knew this silence well. They had stood in it and ridden through it and emerged from the far side of it sometimes diminished, sometimes transformed, always marked, more times and in more places than the romantic literature that surrounds them would suggest. The popular imagination gives the Musketeers palace corridors and candle-lit duels, and the perfumed intrigues of Versailles. The historical record gives them siege trenches in the rain, cavalry charges across broken ground, the long grinding patience of campaign warfare in the 17th century, and the specific unglamorous courage required to do difficult and dangerous work, not for a single dramatic moment, but across weeks and months and years of sustained military service. Understanding the battles of the Musketeers means understanding the nature of warfare in the age they inhabited. And that nature was, in many ways, defined by the siege, the open field battle, the kind of engagement that later centuries would romanticize most heavily, with its sweeping cavalry movements and its decisive clashes of infantry. Existed in the 17th century, but it was not the dominant form of military activity. Most of the real work of 17th century warfare was done in the slow, methodical, technically demanding business of taking and defending fortified positions. Europe in this period was covered in fortifications, towns and cities ringed with walls, supplemented by the revolutionary new geometric designs of engineers like Vauban, who had responded to the challenge of gunpowder by developing fortification systems specifically engineered to absorb and deflect artillery fire. Taking such a position was not a matter of heroic charge and swift resolution. It was a matter of weeks, sometimes months, of approach trenches and parallel lines dug in careful stages toward the walls, of artillery positioned to batter specific sections of the defenses, of infantry waiting in exposed positions under fire for the moment when a breach appeared wide enough to assault. It was in this environment that the Musketeers fought most consistently and most consequentially during the long wars of Louis XIV's reign. The siege of Maastricht in 1673 stands as perhaps the most significant single engagement in the history of the Corps. Significant not only for its military outcome, but for the cost it extracted, and what that cost reveals about the character of the men who paid it. Maastricht was a heavily fortified Dutch city of considerable strategic importance, sitting at the convergence of the Maas River and several key supply routes through the Low Countries. Louis XIV wanted it. His army, under the king's personal command. Louis XIV was not a monarch who watched his wars from a comfortable distance, had invested the city in June of 1673, and Vauban himself was directing the siege works with his characteristic methodical precision. The approach trenches had been dug. The artillery had been positioned. The moment had come to assault a specific section of the outer defenses. A demi-lune, one of the forward-projecting elements of the fortification system, positioned to provide flanking fire against anyone approaching the main walls. Taking it was necessary. Taking it would also be extremely costly, because the defenders knew it was coming and had prepared accordingly. D'Artagnan led the assault. What this meant, in practical terms, is worth visualizing clearly, rather than allowing it to pass behind the veil of general military language. It meant that he placed himself at the front of the attacking force, not from behind, directing, observing, protected by the bodies of the men between him and the enemy, but physically at the front, in the most exposed position, going first into the ground that was most heavily covered by defensive fire. This was not unusual for officers of the period, and particularly not for musketeer officers. The culture of the Corps placed a specific value on leading from the front, not as performance but as a statement of intent, a signal to the men behind that the officer had made the same calculation they had made and had arrived at the same conclusion, that the thing needed to be done, and that the possibility of dying while doing it was not a reason to do it slowly or from a safe distance. D'Artagnan was struck by a musket ball in the throat during the assault. He died within minutes, at the edge of the position his men went on to take. Louis XIV, watching from the siege lines with his commanders around him, was informed immediately. The accounts that survive from men present that day describe a king who went quiet in a way that was distinctly different from his ordinary composure, a silence that those who knew him well recognized as genuine grief rather than the managed, public stillness he typically deployed. He said, by one account, that he had lost the finest soldier in his kingdom. He may have meant it as a formal compliment, the kind of thing kings say when notable men die in their service. But the evidence of his conduct in the years he and D'Artagnan had worked together suggests he also meant it simply as a statement of fact. The fall of Maastricht, which came shortly after, the city surrendering to French forces on the 30th of June, was complete. The campaign objective had been achieved, but the Musketeers had paid for it in a way they would not quickly forget. To focus exclusively on Maastricht, however, would be to miss the broader canvas of places where the Musketeers earned the reputation that history has preserved. The wars of Louis XIV were vast and varied, and the Musketeers appeared in them consistently, across decades and across geography, in roles that ranged from the straightforwardly military to the considerably more complex. The Franco-Dutch War, which ran from 1672 to 1678, saw the Musketeers engaged across multiple campaigns in the Low Countries, a theatre of war that was physically punishing in ways specific to its geography. The Low Countries in the 17th century were a landscape of rivers, canals, flooded polders, and carefully managed water systems that the Dutch could and did weaponize by opening sluice gates and flooding entire regions to slow an advancing army. Moving through this terrain with heavy equipment, maintaining supply lines, keeping men healthy and functional in conditions of persistent cold and damp. These were challenges that required not merely courage but endurance, adaptability, and the particular kind of organizational discipline that keeps a military unit functional when the environment itself is working against it. The Musketeers, trained and selected as they were, handled this kind of sustained difficulty better than most. The accounts of their conduct in the Dutch campaigns describe men who maintained their cohesion and their effectiveness under conditions that broke less disciplined formations. The mutual accountability of the brotherhood, the knowledge that your companions were watching not just in moments of danger, but across the full length of a grinding campaign, was part of what made this possible. A man will sometimes find it easier to endure hardship on behalf of the people around him than he would ever find it for an abstract cause or a distant authority. The Musketeers had built this into the structure of their culture deliberately, and it paid returns in exactly the circumstances where it was most needed. The War of Devolution, earlier in Louis XIV's reign, had brought the Musketeers into the Spanish Netherlands, the great arc of territory that included much of what is now Belgium and Luxembourg, in a series of rapid campaigns that demonstrated a different kind of military excellence. Louis XIV's strategy in this conflict was built on speed, on moving quickly enough and in enough force to present the Spanish defenders with a pace of events they could not effectively respond to. The Musketeers were used in this context as a rapid, mobile, striking force, able to ride hard, to arrive ahead of slower-moving infantry formations, and to hold positions or create pressure at points of tactical importance before the main army had fully arrived. This role required exactly the combination of horsemanship, firearm competence, and disciplined independence that the Corps had been training for. Officers capable of making good decisions without waiting for orders, men capable of executing those decisions reliably. It worked. The War of Devolution lasted 18 months and ended with France in possession of a significant stretch of the Spanish Netherlands. The Musketeers had been part of the reason for its success, not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of competent, reliable performance across the whole of the campaign. There were, of course, darker moments. The 9 Years' War, which began in 1688 and pitched France against a broad coalition that included England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and several German principalities, was a different kind of conflict from the rapid successes of the earlier wars. It was longer, harder, more costly, and ultimately less conclusive. France held its own but could not achieve the decisive victories that Louis XIV had come to expect. The Musketeers fought in it, at the siege of Mons, at Namur, at Steenkerke, and in numerous smaller engagements across the long arc of a conflict that ground on for 9 years before resolving into the inconclusive Peace of Ryswick. What the 9 Years' War showed, among other things, was that the Musketeers were not a formation that existed only for victory. They were a formation that could endure, that could absorb the particular psychological damage of a war that did not go as expected, that asked more than it gave back, and that required men to sustain their cohesion and their standards, not in the glow of success, but in the flat grey light of an extended and uncertain struggle. This is a harder test than winning. Many units can fight effectively when they are winning. The units that endure, that maintain their character and their capability through adversity, are the ones that have something more than technique. They have culture. They have the internalized code that functions even when external circumstances provide no reinforcement, no reward, no confirmation that what is being done is working. The Musketeers had this. The 9 Years' War confirmed it in the least comfortable way possible. Beyond these major campaigns, the Musketeers were deployed throughout the period in roles that defy simple military categorization. They served as escorts for diplomatic missions of the highest sensitivity, moving through potentially hostile territory with the responsibility not merely of protecting their charges physically, but of representing France's prestige in environments where every detail of conduct was being assessed. They were used to convey royal communications of a sensitive nature, dispatches and instructions that could not be trusted to ordinary couriers, that required both the physical security of an elite escort and the discretion of men who would not read what they were carrying or discuss it afterward. They served, on occasion, as the Crown's instrument in domestic situations of considerable delicacy, the arrest of Fouquet being the most famous example, but by no means the only one. A kingdom the size of France in the 17th century generated a continuous supply of situations in which the formal machinery of justice was either too slow, too public, too politically entangled, or too uncertain in its loyalties to be relied upon. The Musketeers filled the space that this created. They were, in these moments, the king's direct hand, moved by his will, bound by his authority, and capable of doing what the situation required with the minimum of collateral disruption. This breadth of deployment, from the siege trenches of Flanders to the corridors of Versailles to the roads of France carrying sealed dispatches through the night, was itself a form of institutional achievement. It required a level of versatility that went beyond most military formations. The Musketeers were not specialists in a single kind of operation. They were generalists of excellence, capable across a range of demands wide enough that the Crown could reach for them whenever the requirement was both serious and uncertain in its specific character. That versatility was not accidental. It was the product of training that deliberately ranged across multiple domains, of selection that prioritized judgment and adaptability alongside raw physical capability, and of a culture that valued the man who could assess a novel situation and respond appropriately over the man who was brilliant within a narrow set of predictable conditions. War, after all, is the domain of the novel and the unpredictable. It does not present the same situation twice. The commander who has prepared his men for a specific kind of engagement will win, perhaps, the battle that happens to resemble that preparation. The commander who has prepared his men to think, to adapt, to hold their formation and their judgment under conditions of uncertainty. That commander is prepared for war as it actually is, rather than war as it appeared in the planning. The Musketeers were prepared for war as it actually was, and the battlefields of 17th century Europe, from the flooded lowlands of the Dutch Republic to the stone fortifications of the Spanish Netherlands, to the river crossings and the siege lines and the dark roads of a dozen campaigns. All of those places hold, somewhere in their ground, the mark of men who came there prepared, who did what was asked of them, and who, in doing it, built a reputation that 4 centuries of retelling have not been able to diminish. That reputation was not made in a palace. It was made in exactly the places where reputation always is made. In the cold, specific, unforgiving moments when everything depended on who you actually were, rather than who you had always intended to be. The Musketeers, in those moments, were exactly who they needed to be. Almost always. And in the instances where they fell short, where a man was lost, where a position could not be held, where the cost of the thing exceeded what could reasonably have been expected, they grieved their dead with a particular, private grief of men who understood what had been given, and they continued, because that, too, was part of what they were. Segment 6. The Twilight and the Legacy. What became of them, and why we still remember. All things that are built by human hands are also, eventually, undone by them. This is not a tragedy exactly. It is simply the nature of institutions, of any arrangement that depends on the sustained will of successive generations of people to maintain it, fund it, believe in it, and subordinate their individual interests to its collective purpose. That will is not permanent. It fluctuates with circumstance, with leadership, with the particular pressures of any given historical moment. And when it fluctuates too far, for too long, in the wrong direction, the institution begins to change. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then with the gathering momentum of something that has been weakening for a long time, and has finally reached the point where the weakness becomes visible. The Musketeers did not end badly. They did not collapse in disgrace, or dissolve in the aftermath of some catastrophic failure, or simply cease to function because the men within them had forgotten what they were for. Their ending was quieter than that, and in some ways more melancholy, the gradual dimming of something that had once burned very brightly, in a world that had moved on to other concerns and other arrangements. The decline began, as it so often does, with the death of a king. Louis XIV died in September of 1715, after a reign of 72 years, the longest of any major European monarch. He died as he had lived, deliberately, in full view, according to the elaborate ceremonial protocols that had governed every aspect of his public existence. The Sun King went out, not with a collapse but with a performance, receiving visitors and giving instructions and maintaining, to the end, the presentation of royal dignity that had been his life's most sustained and successful project. What he left behind was an institution. The monarchy, the court, the apparatus of French royal government, that had been built almost entirely around the specific, enormous, unrepeatable fact of his own personality. France, under Louis XIV, worked because Louis XIV was Louis XIV. The court at Versailles functioned because he was at its center, providing the gravitational force that kept everything else in its proper orbit. When that center was removed, the orbits began to drift. His successor, Louis XIV, came to the throne as a child of 5. The third time in living memory that France had begun a reign with a minor on the throne and a regent managing the country's affairs. The regency of Philippe d'Orléans that followed was not incompetent. But it was different. The strict solar certainty of the previous reign gave way to something more relaxed, more skeptical, more intellectually restless. The Enlightenment was beginning to move through French intellectual life with a force that would ultimately reshape everything it touched, including the relationship between the crown and its subjects, and the question of what, precisely, justified the kind of absolute royal authority that institutions like the Musketeers had been built to serve and protect. The Musketeers continued through the Regency and through the long reign of Louis XIV, with their structure largely intact. They still trained. they still maintained their two companies. They still appeared on formal occasions in their blue cloaks, still accompanied the king on campaign when the king went to war, still performed the functions that had defined them for a century. But something had shifted in the quality of the attention given to them. They were no longer the primary expression of what the French crown wished to say about itself. The court of Louis XIV was saying different things, in different registers, through different instruments. The financial pressures that accumulated throughout the 18th century, the cumulative debt of Louis XIV's wars, the expensive misadventures of the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, the structural inadequacies of the French tax system that placed an ever heavier burden on those least able to bear it. These pressures created a persistent argument for rationalization across all areas of royal expenditure. The Musketeers were expensive. They had always been expensive by design. Louis XIV had understood that elite capability cost elite resources and had funded it accordingly. But the financial environment of the mid to late 18th century was no longer one in which this logic carried the weight it once had. In 1776, under Louis XVI, the last king of France before the Revolution, the Musketeers were disbanded for the first time. The decision was made by the finance minister Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, as part of a broader program of royal spending reduction that was itself a symptom of the fiscal crisis steadily gathering beneath the surface of French society. The disbandment was presented as a temporary rationalization. It was, in practice, the beginning of the end. The corps was briefly reconstituted in 1789, almost simultaneously, with dark historical irony, with the opening of the Estates General that would set the French Revolution in motion. The timing could not have been worse, or perhaps more revealing. The Musketeers were being restored at the precise moment that the world that had produced them, the world of absolute monarchy and noble military culture and the elaborate social arrangements of the Ancien Regime, was beginning its terminal collapse. The Revolution swept all of it away. The monarchy, the court, the noble hierarchy, the entire apparatus of royal France that had given the Musketeers their reason for existence. All of it was gone within a few years of extraordinary, violent, transformative upheaval. The Musketeers were abolished, along with everything else associated with the old order. Many of their number went into exile. Some returned to their provincial estates and attempted to live quietly through the dangerous years that followed. Some did not survive. Napoleon briefly restored a version of the corps under his own imperial arrangements, as he restored and adapted many of the forms of the old monarchy for his own purposes. But it was not the same thing. Could not be the same thing because the world it had inhabited was gone past recovering. The Musketeers of Napoleon's court were a reconstruction, a gesture toward a tradition, rather than the living continuation of something that had been growing and deepening for a century and a half. The final, definitive end came in 1816, under the restored Bourbon monarchy of Louis XVI. The reconstituted corps was disbanded for the last time, 4 years after Waterloo, in a France still reorganizing itself after the convulsions of revolution and empire and the long Napoleonic Wars. The Musketeers of the King of France ceased to exist as a functioning institution. They had lasted, in one form or another, for almost exactly 200 years. What remained was the memory, and the memory, as it turned out, was more durable than the institution itself. Alexandre Dumas published The Three Musketeers in 1844, 28 years after the corps had been finally dissolved. He was writing about a world that had been gone for most of a century, drawing on historical sources, on oral traditions, on the particular romantic energy of a France in the middle of the 19th century that was simultaneously racing toward industrial modernity and looking backward with considerable nostalgia at the more vivid, more dramatically legible world of the 17th century. Dumas was a storyteller of genius, not a historian, and not pretending to be one. And what he captured was not the precise factual texture of the real Musketeers, but something in some ways more important, the spirit of the thing, the sense of what it had meant, and why it had mattered. The brotherhood, the code, the particular combination of personal honor and institutional loyalty that had made the core what it was. The book became, almost immediately, one of the most widely read novels in the world. It has not stopped being read since. It has been translated into virtually every major language. It has been adapted for stage, film, television, and every other medium that storytelling has moved through in the century and 3/4 since its publication. The Musketeers entered the global imagination with a force that the real institution, for all its genuine achievement, could not quite have generated alone. But here is what is worth understanding as we sit with this history and feel for what is real within it. Dumas did not invent the qualities that make the Musketeers endure in the imagination. He found them. He found them in the historical record, in the documents and accounts and traditions of a real institution, and he recognized in them something that spoke to the deepest concerns of human beings living in any era whatsoever: the loyalty, the brotherhood, the code that placed obligation to your companions and your principles above convenience or personal safety. The idea that the men beside you are your responsibility and you are theirs, and that this mutual responsibility is not a burden, but the very thing that makes a life meaningful. These are not 17th century ideas. They are human ideas. They appear in different forms, in different uniforms, in different historical moments, because they are responding to something permanent in human experience. The desire to belong to something larger than oneself, to be held to a standard by people who matter, to know that your presence makes a difference to the people around you, and that theirs makes a difference to you. The Musketeers lived this with unusual clarity and unusual discipline. They built a culture around it that survived for 2 centuries in one of the most volatile political environments in European history. They earned, in the process, a reputation that has survived for 4 centuries after that, long past the dissolution of the institution, long past the world that produced it, long past every other political and social arrangement of their era. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a remarkable thing to have accomplished. Stand again, if you will, on that quiet road behind the Palais Royal in the early morning, the mist on the cobblestones, the thinness of the modern noise, the sense, if you stay still enough and patient enough, that the space around you is not quite empty, that something of what happened here, of what these men were, and what they meant to each other and to the country they served, has not entirely dissipated into the ordinary air. History rarely preserves the physical traces of the things that mattered most. The barracks are gone. The training grounds are unrecognizable. The particular quality of a November morning in Paris in 1660, with a company of musketeers riding through streets that no longer exist, is lost beyond any recovery. What is not lost is the understanding of what they were, why they were built, what it cost to become one of them, and what it meant to be one of them. To the men who carried that identity through campaigns and courts and duels and the long ordinary days between all of those things, it meant that you were never entirely alone. It meant that your word was your bond, and your companions' burdens were your own, and that there was a version of yourself that you were obligated to be, not because someone was watching, but because you were watching, because the men beside you were watching, and because the standard was real and worth the difficulty of meeting it, one for all, and all for one. 400 years old, that idea, still standing.